Caution: the Ember and Ink Studios is not responsible for ruining your childhood. The stories you are about to hear come from historical folklore and the earliest recorded versions of familiar fairy tales. These are the versions that existed before they were softened for children. Listener discretion is advised. Before we begin tonight's story, it's worth asking a simple question. What exactly is a fairy tale? A fairy tale is a type of folk story passed down through generations, often long before it was ever written down. These stories were told around fires, in homes, and in village squares, slowly changing with each telling. Despite the name, fairy tales do not always involve fairies. Instead, they usually contain magical elements, strange creatures, curses, transformations, and impossible journeys. Many of the versions we know today were recorded in the 19th century by collectors like the Brothers Grimm, but the stories themselves are often far older. And while modern audiences think of fairy tales as stories for children, the earliest versions were rarely so gentle. They were cautionary tales, moral lessons, and reflections of the fears and dangers of the world in which they were told. Tonight's story is one of those tales. And like many stories that have survived for centuries, the darker details are often the ones people forget. Before we begin tonight's story, a small fairy tale fact. Cinderella is one of the oldest and most widespread fairy tales ever recorded. Versions of the story appear across cultures and centuries, long before the one most people know today. Tonight we open another page in the dark origins of fairy tales. Episode 1: Cinderella, the version they didn't tell you. Most people believe they know the story of Cinderella. A young girl is mistreated by her stepmother and stepsisters. Through magic and kindness, she attends a royal ball. A glass slipper reveals her identity, and she marries the prince. It is a story of hope, of dreams rewarded, and of happily ever after. But the story most people know today is not the original. Not even close. One of the earliest recorded Cinderella-type stories comes not from Germany or France, but from ancient Greece. The story was written down by the Greek historian Strabo. It tells the story of a young Greek slave girl named Rhodopis living in Egypt. One day, while she is bathing, an eagle swoops down and steals one of her sandals. The bird flies away and drops the sandal into the lap of the Egyptian king. The king is amazed by the delicate shoe and becomes convinced that its owner must be someone extraordinary. He orders a search across the land to find the woman whose foot fits the sandal. Eventually, the search leads to Rhodopis. When the sandal fits her perfectly, the king marries her. The story contains no fairy godmother, no pumpkin carriage, and no glass slipper. But the central idea remains the same: a lost shoe, a search across the kingdom, and a girl whose life is changed forever. The version familiar to modern audiences was popularized by the French writer Charles Perrault in 1697. In that telling, we find the elements most people recognize: a fairy godmother, a pumpkin carriage, glass slippers, and a magical night that ends at midnight. It is a gentle story, meant to entertain and inspire. But when the tale was later collected by the Brothers Grimm in their famous 1812 collection, Grimm's Fairy Tales, the tone was very different. Much darker, and far closer to the harsh moral lessons common in old European folklore. In the Grimm version, the girl is known as Aschenputtel. There is no fairy godmother. Instead, Cinderella plants a tree on her mother's grave. Each day she visits the grave and waters the tree with her tears. Over time, the tree grows, and white birds begin to perch in its branches. When Cinderella wishes for help, the birds answer. They drop beautiful dresses and silver shoes from the branches so she may attend the prince's festival. But the prince does not recognize her. Each night she escapes before he can discover her identity. Eventually the prince spreads pitch on the palace steps so that one of the mysterious maiden's shoes will stick. This time the plan works. A golden slipper is left behind. The prince announces that he will marry the woman whose foot fits the shoe. And this is where the story turns darker. The sisters' desperation. When the prince arrives at Cinderella's house, the stepmother encourages her daughters to try on the slipper, but their feet are too large. So the mother gives them a knife. The first sister cuts off her toes. She forces her foot into the shoe. The prince believes she is the mysterious maiden and rides away with her. But as they pass the grave of Cinderella's mother, the white birds cry out, "Look back! Look back! The shoe is too small. There is blood in the shoe." The prince looks down and sees blood pouring from the slipper. He realizes the deception and returns. The second sister tries. This time she cuts off her heel. Again she rides away with the prince. And again the birds reveal the truth. Finally the prince asks if there is another daughter in the house. Cinderella is brought forward. The slipper fits perfectly. The grim ending. The prince marries Cinderella, but the story does not end with the wedding. At the ceremony, the two stepsisters attend, hoping to gain favor with the new queen. As they walk beside Cinderella, the white birds swoop down. One pecks out the eye of the first sister. The other blinds the second. According to the story, they are condemned to wander blind for the rest of their lives, punished for their cruelty and deception. In early fairy tales, justice was rarely gentle. An even older Cinderella. But the Grimm version was not the beginning of the story either. One of the oldest known Cinderella-like tales appears in China during the 9th century. It was recorded in the collection, Yu Yang Zazu. In that story, a girl named Ye Xian lives with a cruel stepmother. Her only friend is a magical fish. When the stepmother discovers the fish, she kills it. But Ye Xian keeps the fish bones, which possess magical powers. With their help, she attends a festival wearing beautiful clothes. Like Cinderella, she loses a shoe while fleeing the crowd. The shoe is discovered by a king, who becomes obsessed with finding the woman whose foot fits it. Eventually, Ye Xian is discovered and marries the king. The story contains many of the same elements that appear later in Europe, which suggests something fascinating. The Cinderella story may have traveled across continents for centuries before ever appearing in a European fairy tale book. Why fairy tales were so dark. Stories like Cinderella were never originally meant only for children. They were part of oral storytelling traditions that pass down lessons about morality, survival, and justice. Cruelty was punished, kindness was rewarded, and the consequences were often extreme because the lesson needed to be clear. These tales reflected the harsh realities of the world in which they were told. A world where life could be brutal and justice was rarely gentle. Today, the story of Cinderella is remembered as a tale of magic and romance, but hidden inside that familiar story are fragments of something much older. A tale that traveled across continents, changed shape through centuries, and carried a darker message than the one most of us remember. Because long before fairy tales became bedtime stories, they were warnings. The story may be familiar, but the truth behind it rarely is. Sorry, Star Trek fans. Pavel Chekhov was wrong in believing that Cinderella was a Russian epic. I found no proof of this while doing research for this story. Until next time, another page waits in the dark origins of fairy tales. Bonus story. While Cinderella became one of the most famous fairy tales ever told, many lesser-known stories share similar themes of disguise, hardship, and hidden identity. One such tale comes from the German collection of the Brothers Grimm and is known as Catskin or Allerleiro. In this darker story, a king loses his beloved queen. Before her death, she makes him promise that if he ever remarries, it must only be to a woman as beautiful as she was. Years pass, and the king eventually realizes that the only woman who matches his late queen's beauty is his own daughter. The princess is horrified and desperately tries to avoid the marriage. To delay the wedding, she asks her father for impossible gifts: a dress as golden as the sun, a dress as silver as the moon, and a dress as radiant as the stars. The king provides them all. With no other way to escape, the princess disguises herself in a cloak made from the skins of animals and flees the castle. Covered in filth and fur, she hides her identity and becomes a servant in another kingdom's kitchen. By day she appears as nothing more than a ragged girl called Catskin, but at night she secretly wears the magical dresses she brought with her. Eventually, the prince of that kingdom discovers her true identity during a series of royal celebrations. Just like Cinderella, the mystery of the girl in disguise leads to her recognition and marriage. But unlike Cinderella, the darker shadow of the tale remains. A princess forced to flee her own father to escape a fate she could not accept. Stories like Catskin remind us that many fairy tales were not simply stories of magic and happy endings. They were reflections of fear, danger, and survival in a far harsher world. Thank you for listening. If you're interested in the dark origins of fairy tales, why not subscribe? It's free, I promise. Turn on notifications and never miss another chapter. Leave a comment. Is there a fairy tale you'd like to know the dark origin? Let us know. And don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. It really helps us out. We hope you've enjoyed this dark origins of fairy tales. Return next week for a new episode, Sleeping Beauty, the story that shouldn't be a bedtime tale.